Murdock's Music Minute, welcome. This is another episode of my Getting Into series, which always asks itself the question, what would be 5 albums of any given artist or band for newbies, for beginners to get into the studio discography. And today I'll look at an iconic band with an immense studio discography, the Beach Boys. America's band number one, at least for some. Arguably, this is a discography with mighty highs and I think even Beach Boys hardcore fans wouldn't really disagree with it. Also, some really irritating lows. So, if you want to get into the Beach Boys studio discography for real, so apart from the obvious entrance point by means of various greatest hits and best of compilations, what would be 5 albums to start your journey? Not always necessarily the critically most acclaimed albums. Of course, very often the essential or well-known albums. But let's find out what I chose to get into the Beach Boys. Formed by 3 brothers, their cousin, and a good friend when they were all young teenagers, the Beach Boys symbolize nostalgic, wholesome, fun, but ultimately harmless American teenagehood. They came to represent white rock and rollers that, of course, wanted to see the girls on the beach, but would always stay well-mannered while doing so. Surfing, beach, cars, sunshine, girls. That's what the Beach Boys stood for in the early years, and that's what they actually still stand for now in 2025. All served in the form of catchy pop tunes that have their roots in doo-wop, rock and roll, but also some jazz harmonies. And what set them apart from their peers, of course, were their fantastic voices and the blending of their voices and the often immaculate harmonies that they came up with for their, on the surface, simplistic songs. With this formula, the Beach Boys soon became a hit machine to be taken seriously, especially in the mid-60s. The first couple of albums that all follow this formula are both cute and crude. That is not to say that these albums are neglectable, especially Surfin' USA and Surfer Girl are perfect examples for the early sound of the Beach Boys, but maybe the sound of the early 60s in general, and are highly recommended for fans of any 60s nostalgia or surf pop. I will start my list, however, with an entry from a little later, their 6th studio album, released in 1964, when the boys slowly started to emancipate themselves from their first producer, or actually from the first manager, none other than the Wilsons' father, Murray Wilson, not always an easy character. And the first time that Brian Wilson, who was a little bit of the creative mastermind in the background, focused or wanted to focus more on the album as a listening experience that could be enjoyed from start to finish, and that should be more than simply a random collection of maybe 2 or 3 catchy singles, some hopefully decent originals and a lot of cover versions, or, well, let's put it frankly, filler material. The result is 1964's All Summer Long. Not a perfect album by all means, but this one, for maybe the last time, encapsulates brilliantly the spirit and the image of those early Beach Boys years. Wilson's drive to get away from the often rushed cash ins, usually dictated by the label, that were some of the early Beach Boys albums, also, of course, came from Beatlemania and the British invasion in general, that really gave a lot of US acts a run for their money. By maintaining their surf pop sound and their Californian identity, but at the same time improving the quality of album tracks and of production overall, the Beach Boys managed to rival the Beatles in the mid-60s. All Summer Long opens with one of the most iconic Beach Boys singles, I Get Around, a masterpiece in pop arrangement. This is harmony, vocal pop, and rock and roll at the same time, and it became the Beach Boys' first really big #1 hit. The title track is the very epitome of teenage life in the 60s in California, but it also cleverly incorporates some rather unusual instrumentation, something that Brian Wilson was increasingly interested in. The song starts with a skippy xylophone motif. You have flutes and some, I think, bass harmonicas, a very unusual sound actually, but all this leads to a very summery, in the truest sense of the word, pop song. Little Honda takes the surf rock sound, but is a song about, well, a Honda motorbike, or a little lightweight motorbike that could also be used by teenagers. It's a fun song. Wendy is the typical 60s end of a love relationship pop ballad, but showcases the fantastic harmony vocals of the boys. On the short, straightforward Do You Remember, the group pays tribute to all of their heroes and influences from early 1950s rock and roll. And Girls on the Beach is a heartfelt but also sensual ballad with quite intricate use of harmony, vocals, and harmonic shifts. This is one of the songs that shows the most how much the music of the Beach Boys had progressed from 1962. So this is an album that sort of wraps up the early phase of the Beach Boys, where they once more deliver what fans and critics had come to expect from them, namely this surf-influenced pop sound with lyrics about girls and summer. But the album at the same time already musically points ahead to the more sophisticated and maybe also interesting things that the Beach Boys would do, especially under the helm of Brian Wilson. Especially in the mid-60s, the Beach Boys were extremely prolific. It was not unusual for them to put out 2 or even 3 albums per year, especially in the period 1964, 1965. And my second pick is one of those 1965 albums. Maybe not the one that Beach Boys experts would expect now, because I'm talking about Summer Days and Summer Nights, as mentioned, released in 1965. This album was a response to the comparatively lower sales of the more introspective, more um, orchestral, complex arrangements of the previous album today, which is, by the way, highly recommended, but it's simply not one that I put on my list for Beach Boys beginners. So now we are talking about the follow-up album, the much more upbeat and commercial Summer Days and Summer Nights. At this point, the label was back putting pressure on the Beach Boys and especially Brian Wilson to come up with, some proper charts material, hit singles, and maybe could you return to what made you successful in the first place, namely catchy pop tunes about the beach, surfing, girls, and cars. Now, Brian Wilson at this point was really somewhere else musically, and overall, or in general, the Beach Boys were getting a bit tired of their image as lightweight teeny boppers and, eternal teenagers. So, Brian Wilson with Summer Days and Summer Nights admittedly took compromises by returning to maybe the more formulaic aspects of the early Beach Boys hit singles, and yet combining them with his progressed mastery as a producer and his more complex songwriting. And thus, he came up with maybe the most satisfying and most fun pop album the Beach Boys put out during the entire 1960s. Parts of this album play almost like a greatest hits compilation, especially the middle section of this album is surprisingly strong. You've got tracks like Then I Kissed Her, which pays homage to Brian Wilson's big idol, Phil Spector. Girl Don't Tell Me, for some listeners, sounds like the attempt of the Beach Boys to write something a little bit more in the vein of the Beatles. And then you have maybe the most iconic Beach Boys song ever on this album. This is where this famous track had its original home, California Girls. Also, Help Me Rhonda was another hit single. It appeared on this album in the more famous single edit. Help Me Rhonda had a former version that appeared on the album before today. Here you get the more famous and, in my opinion, also a superior version of Help Me Rhonda. You're So Good to Me, with its catchy melody and stomping rhythm, is a little bit unusual for the typical Beach Boys sound, but it's another great Beach Boys track. I don't think it ever was a single, even though it sounds like a single, and it's a song that you will recognize. So, an album that is very pleasant on the ears, very accessible, and filled with little 60s gems. Even the, for some fans, lesser album tracks like Girl from New York City or Amusement Parks USA are very entertaining and more than decent. The album finishes with a beautiful little a cappella track, something that the Beach Boys also liked to do on their albums, starting actually from the mid-60s. And Your Dreams Come True, which really sounds like you are eavesdropping on the Beach Boys, maybe warming up for a live gig, or being very intimate in the studio, just their voices. Excellent pop album, maybe one of my favorite pop albums from the 1960s, Summer Days and Summer Nights from 1965. But by that time, Brian Wilson already had higher and very different artistic aspirations. He wanted to put the focus on the pop or the rock album as a work of art and a coherent piece of work that maybe even tells a story or at least a musical theme from beginning to end. Of course, again, he was here spurred on by the Beatles, who from the mid-60s onwards really progressed in quantum leaps, beginning with Rubber Soul, which was then followed by Revolver. 1 year in pop music during the 1960s sometimes meant complete change and, huge developments. And Brian Wilson wanted to be part of that. And in fact, he wanted to make the biggest, the most important, or the best rock album ever. And this one, for some people, is the only Beach Boys album that is ever talked about. And of course, I had to include it here on my list for getting into the Beach Boys. Of course, I'm talking about Pet Sounds, one of the most well-known albums, one of the most critically acclaimed albums of all times. It revolutionized the way pop music is viewed by critics. It revolutionized the way pop music is arranged and produced as well. It came at some cost for the band because Pet Sounds basically was a Brian Wilson solo project with a lot of professional studio musicians, the famous Wrecking Crew. He recorded those tracks, the backing tracks, while the rest of the band was touring Japan. At that point, Brian Wilson had decided to stop touring with the band and rather work as the songwriter and arranger in the studio. He also had a nervous breakdown before that, which also helped him in making this decision. But maybe this also caused a little bit of a split between him and the rest of the band, and differences in opinions regarding the artistic direction of the group. Allegedly, at least some of the band members were taken aback when they returned from the tour and were presented those backing tracks. Pet Sounds wasn't, immediate charts fodder. This is not music that is, instantly a hit. It's not necessarily up-tempo, or a lot of the tracks are not very up-tempo. They don't feature a strong backbeat. On the contrary, Brian Wilson here also worked with elements of the so-called exotica, so he tried to incorporate more percussive instruments, maybe a bit, rhythms that left a bit more space, as opposed to the common 4/4 heavy on the backbeat rhythms that were common in pop and rock music during those days. You also get a lot of at least semi-orchestral arrangements that sometimes move the music rather towards a kind of cocktail lounge or easy listening sound. But this is not meant as a negative criticism. It's simply not what teenagers, pop consumers were used to in 1966. With the help of external lyricist Tony Asher, Wilson wrote very introspective songs about spirituality, self-awareness, finding your true self, but mostly also coming of age, developing a certain vulnerability in romantic relationships, all combined with a sense of loss and nostalgia. The music on Pet Sounds is, for a pop record, extremely complex, especially, as mentioned, the instrumental arrangements, but also the vocal arrangements and the harmonies are some of the most complex harmonies you will ever find on a Beach Boys album. That, of course, made it extremely difficult and, in some cases, even impossible to recreate those tracks live on stage. Pet Sounds, maybe as a consequence of all that, and maybe also the stark contrast between the packaging of this album, which still features a rather nondescript cover photo shoot, but then this very intricate music. So all this combined maybe was the reason that Pet Sounds was rather a slow burner in the US, and even though it reached number 10 of the charts, compared to former Beach Boys albums, this was regarded as a little bit of a flop at first, but it became a huge hit in the UK, and it established Brian Wilson, at least for a while, as the most visionary pop songwriter, pop composer, and producer of the 1960s. And even though Pet Sounds isn't avant-garde experimentation and, well, definitely easy on the ear, I think still this is an album that you need to spend a little time with to fully appreciate. At least for me, I have to admit, this was a grower album. And it features, of course, some of the most beloved Beach Boys classics. Wouldn't It Be Nice, which probably still sounds the most like classic Beach Boys pop singles. The gorgeously aching and a bit tranquil Don't Talk, Put Your Head on My Shoulder. The beautiful I'm Waiting for the Day. And maybe above all of those songs, God Only Knows. One of the most critically acclaimed songs from the 60s. And at least at one point, Paul McCartney's favorite song of all times. Also, the rather sad ballad Caroline No is one of the Beach Boys' essentials. And almost tagged on or included in a last-minute decision, also Sloop John B is on this album. A bit of an outlier compared to the other tracks, but that's the one that probably had the most commercial appeal. Number 3 on my Getting Into the Beach Boys album lists, not meant as a ranking, but in chronological order, from 1966, Pet Sounds. With Pet Sounds, Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys wanted to be taken seriously as pop artists, and for a while it seemed as if Brian Wilson really could have become one of the most important musicians of the late 60s, maybe even topping the Beatles, if only his next project for the Beach Boys had been finished. The Teenage Symphony to God, a psychedelic concept album, maybe one of the most avant-garde projects ever put to tape by a mainstream band. The album Smile, which was never finished because of tensions within the band, Brian Wilson's increasing drug consumption, again pressure from the label, and finally what you can only call a nervous breakdown of Brian Wilson, who, after this failure of what would have been his masterpiece, never really was the same person again, and who also never again was this extremely dominant figure within the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys also made some not very optimal decisions. For example, they declined to appear at the Monterey Pop Festival, and very quickly in those years, they lost the touch with the spirit of the times and with their audience, and very soon looked, in comparison to the Beatles or also a lot of new bands and groups that emerged, rather old-fashioned and uncool. In the later years of the 1960s, practically all of their albums flopped, even though listening to them nowadays, without the context or without comparing them to their hipper peers in rock music, uh, all of these albums are very interesting and definitely recommended to listen to. And my number 4 album to get into the Beach Boys actually still belongs to that phase, or marks the end of that phase, maybe. An album that originally was a huge flop for the Beach Boys, and really, really disappointed the band, who had high hopes for this release. An album that should start the new decade for the band. They had a bit of a change in their lineup, with Bruce Johnston joining the band in the mid or late 60s. They had changed label and were really struggling to maintain a certain relevance in the pop landscape. And so in 1970, they dropped an album called Sunflower, which is a beautiful, almost perfect collection of ballads, pop songs, and even more rocking moments, introducing a bit of a more modern sound for the 1970s. Whilst up to 1967, 1968, Brian Wilson was the director of the Beach Boys. Now also the other band members, the other Wilson brothers, but also the relatively newbies, Al Jardine and Bruce Johnston, had started to come into their own as songwriters, and all the members of the Beach Boys brought in their own songs, which made for interesting and varied collections of songs. Bruce Johnston was the expert when it came to maybe a little bit sappy, nostalgic ballads, but when he hit the sweet spot, he really hit the sweet spot, and he did so on Sunflower, in my opinion, with the dreamy Deirdre and the more sentimental, almost a bit melodramatic, but also quite gorgeous Tears in the Morning. Dennis Wilson wrote some of the hardest rocking tracks for the Beach Boys during that period. The cool Slip On Through and the powerhouse It's About Time. Sunflower also features some of the more underrated Brian Wilson tracks, and the very intriguing, reverb-heavy All I Wanna Do, a collaboration between Brian Wilson and Mike Love that sounds as lush as it must have sounded futuristic in 1970. Unfortunately, back in 1970, almost nobody took notice of this. Nowadays, this track has become a bit of a cult track. Simply a fantastic collection of songs, Sunflower from 1970. The Beach Boys went through more lineup changes in the early 70s and tried to find a sound for the 1970s with varying degrees of success. However, if you enjoy Sunflower, I deeply recommend that you also listen to the other Beach Boys album from the first half of the 1970s, Surf's Up, and one of my personal favorites, Holland. All of these albums, while maybe not providing that classic Beach Boys sound, but all of these albums are extremely intriguing. Some great songs are on those albums, and yeah, overall, I think I said it also in other videos about the Beach Boys. I think they are extremely underrated, as well as the late 60s albums by the band. But now, for the last spot, or the last slot on my getting into the Beach Boys list, we will move forward basically to the end. After Holland, arguably the discography of the Beach Boys becomes very spotty. They dabbled a little bit with soft rock in the late 70s, but somehow also lost a bit of their identity. And in the 1980s, simply decided that they wanted to live on the nostalgic image of, sun, beaches, and surfboards, and did some fun but also some really dreadful, really forgettable pop albums. Dennis Wilson, unfortunately, died in the early 80s. He drowned, also had problems with drugs and alcohol. Carl Wilson passed away from cancer in 1998. And by that time, the Beach Boys already had become rather a vehicle for Mike Love as a nostalgic legacy act. Brian Wilson himself left the group, then he returned briefly, and then he parted ways again with the Beach Boys. And yeah, throughout the 70s and 80s at least, he continuously struggled with a drug habit and severe mental problems, mental health problems. He became the victim of an unscrupulous psychotherapist who more and more controlled and dominated Brian Wilson's life, and Brian Wilson also as an artist. He even cashed in on royalties. That alone is such a bizarre story in itself that I could fill an entire video with it. In the later 80s and the 1990s, the Beach Boys hardly ever recorded new material. They had one more big hit with the notorious Kokomo. But in 2012, for their 50th band anniversary, the remaining living members of the Beach Boys united once more. Brian Wilson produced another of their albums, and this is most likely their final album, the last album we will ever hear from the Beach Boys, and it is my maybe a bit debatable pick number 5 for getting into the Beach Boys. 2012's That's Why God Made the Radio. An album that presents the Beach Boys as elderly gentlemen, aged musicians, who look back at an illustrious career and who look back at their strengths and the style and sound that people love them for. So while this album doesn't return to classic surf rock, definitely the sound references especially the mid-60s with a lot of allusions to, elements from Pet Sounds, elements from Smile, and also elements from earlier albums that I have mentioned in this video. Not every track on this late career album is pure gold, but there are simply some charming and heartwarming moments for any Beach Boys fan to be found on That's Why God Made the Radio. The title track itself is a very nostalgic ballad with a very sweet melody and lyrics about cruising in your car with your girl and listening to some sweet music from the radio. Daybreak over the ocean and Beaches in Mind are nostalgic fun that is well made, and these songs still show that the Beach Boys haven't lost their talent for great vocal arrangements. You can hear that their voices have aged, and there seems to be a little bit of voice enhancement or even auto-tuning here and there in the production. But on the whole, the sound of this album is a lot more organic than some things the band produced in the 80s and in the 1990s. And the best is saved for last. The final 3 tracks on this album, From There to Back Again, Pacific Coast Highway, and Summer's Gone, are almost heart-wrenchingly beautiful nods back to the Pet Sounds and Smile era. They almost sound like lost songs from those sessions, but only now recorded by the older Beach Boys. What a worthy finale, what a worthy final curtain to the career of one of the most important American bands and one of the most important pop and rock bands on the planet, basically. They even brought back original member David Marks for the sessions on this album, which is also a very heartfelt and beautiful touch. So what more can you ask for as a Beach Boys fan? I think this is probably the best possible album that Beach Boys fans could get in 2012 from the remaining members of the Beach Boys. They bow out with dignity, at least I hope so, unless we will see maybe a Mike Love solo album released under the Beach Boys name, but let's hope this won't happen. So these are 5 albums that I would recommend for starters with the Beach Boys. Let me know if you've listened to those albums, what you think of them. Also, let me know, as always, if you are well versed in the discography of the Beach Boys, which 5 albums you would choose as an introduction to the discography. And of course, if you enjoyed this, give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, tell your grandma all about it, and stay tuned for more Murdock Music Minutes. See you soon.